The child appeared at his door like a ghost from a life he'd tried to forget. No horse tracks in the dirt, no footprints leading to his porch, just a small native girl, maybe 8 years old, standing perfectly still in the doorway, with something clutched against her chest. Silas Ward had lived alone on this remote stretch of land for 7 years, and in all that time, no soul had found their way to his cabin. The girl's dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch. She wasn't crying, wasn't speaking, just staring at him like she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. In her small hands, she held a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn at the edges. Silas stepped back, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle propped against the wall. Not because he feared the child, but because something about this moment felt impossible, wrong. Like the world had shifted while he wasn't paying attention. "Where did you come from?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. The girl extended the paper toward him. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her gaze never wavered. On the outside of the folded letter, written in careful script, were words that made Silas's chest tighten. "For the man who saved my mother." His throat went dry. No one had called him that. No one even knew about. He reached for the letter with unsteady hands, his mind racing back through years he'd buried deep. The girl watched him unfold the paper, her small frame rigid with anticipation. The handwriting was feminine, delicate, but the words hit him like physical blows. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and my daughter has nowhere else to turn. You once showed mercy to a woman who had no right to expect it. I pray you will show the same to my child." Silas looked up sharply. The girl's expression hadn't changed, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, hope. He scanned the horizon behind her, searching for any sign of how she'd arrived. The vast emptiness mocked him with its silence. "Your mother," he started, then stopped. The memory was surfacing now, unbidden and unwelcome. A woman stumbling through a storm, bleeding, desperate. He'd helped her, yes, but it had been so long ago. So brief. He'd assumed she'd forgotten him just as he'd tried to forget that night. The girl took a step closer, and Silas noticed the small bundle tied to her back. Everything she owned, probably. Her lips parted slightly as if she might speak, but instead she pointed to the letter still trembling in his hands. There was more writing below, a date from 3 weeks ago, and then words that changed everything. "They are coming for her. You are her only chance." Silas felt the familiar weight of choices he didn't want to make settling on his shoulders, but when he looked into the child's eyes again, he saw something that made his decision for him. She wasn't just asking for help. She was trusting him with her life. The question was whether he was the same man who had earned that trust all those years ago. Silas stepped aside and gestured for the girl to enter his cabin. She moved past him with careful steps, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The interior was sparse, practical. A table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner. She examined everything with the alertness of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly. He closed the door and turned to face her, the letter still gripping his attention. The child had positioned herself near the far wall, close enough to the window to see outside but with a clear path to the door. Smart girl. Someone had taught her well. "What's your name?" Silas asked, folding the letter carefully. "Ayanna," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The first word she'd spoken, and it carried the weight of careful consideration. Silas nodded slowly. The name stirred something in his memory, but he couldn't place it. He walked to the window and scanned the landscape again. Still nothing, but the feeling of being watched had settled between his shoulder blades like a cold knife. "How long have you been traveling?" he asked, not turning around. 4 days, Ayanna replied. "I walked mostly at night. 4 days. Alone." Silas felt his jaw tighten. She couldn't weigh more than 60 pounds soaking wet, and she'd covered ground that would challenge a grown man. He turned to study her more closely. Dust caked her dark hair, and her simple dress was torn in several places, but her eyes held no self-pity, only determination. "You hungry?" he asked. Ayanna nodded once, quick and efficient. Silas moved to his small store of provisions, pulling out dried meat and hardtack. As he prepared the food, his mind worked through the implications of the letter. Someone was hunting this child. Someone dangerous enough that her dying mother had sent her across dangerous territory to find a man she'd met briefly years ago. He placed the food on the table and sat across from Ayanna. She ate methodically, never taking her eyes off the window for more than a few seconds. The sight of her vigilance made something twist in Silas's chest. No child should have to live like that. The letter mentions people coming for you, he said carefully. Who are they? Ayanna paused mid-bite. For a moment her composure cracked, and Silas caught a glimpse of the frightened child beneath the surface. Men who say I belong to them, she said finally. Men who killed my mother when she wouldn't give me up. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. This wasn't just about protecting a child. This was about standing against people who considered her property. Why you? He asked. What makes you special to them? Ayanna set down the food and reached into her small bundle. She pulled out something wrapped in cloth and placed it on the table between them. When she unwrapped it, Silas felt his blood run cold. It was a small leather pouch, and spilling from it were rough-cut gemstones that caught the light like captured fire. More wealth than most men saw in a lifetime. My mother found these in the river near our village, Ayanna said quietly. Before she died, she told me they were cursed, that they bring nothing but death. Silas stared at the stones, understanding flooding through him. Greed. It always came down to greed. Someone had discovered the source of these gems and wanted to control it, and they believed this child was the key. Outside, a horse whinnied in the distance. Silas's head snapped up and he saw Ayanna stiffen. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the low murmur of men's voices. How many are after you? Silas asked, already moving toward his rifle. 3, Ayanna whispered, quickly rewrapping the stones. Maybe more now. The voices were getting closer, and Silas could make out individual words now. Crude language, threats about what they'd do when they found the girl. His hands tightened on the rifle as he realized they weren't just treasure hunters. They were the kind of men who enjoyed the hunt as much as the prize. Silas motioned for Ayanna to stay low as he moved to the window. 3 men on horseback approached his cabin, their movements deliberate and predatory. The leader was a thick-set man with graying hair and scars that told stories Silas didn't want to hear. His companions flanked him like wolves, their hands resting casually on their weapons. The scarred man dismounted and walked toward the porch with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. His boots echoed on the wooden steps, each footfall a declaration of intent. "We know you're in there, Ward," the man called out, his voice carrying the weight of casual violence. "Saw the girl heading this direction. Makes sense she'd find you." Considering. Silas felt Ayanna's small hand grab his sleeve. Her fingers trembled, but when he looked down, her face was set with grim determination. She knew what these men represented, what they were capable of. "Name's Garrett," the man continued, stopping just outside the door. "Maybe your little friend told you about me. I've been looking forward to meeting the famous Good Samaritan." The way Garrett said it made the words sound like an insult. Silas checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded, then moved to the door. He could feel Ayanna's eyes on him, trusting him to make the right choice. The weight of that trust was heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. "Don't know what you're talking about," Silas called back, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his muscles. Garrett laughed, a sound like broken glass. "That's funny, Ward. Real funny. Because I have it on good authority that you've been harboring stolen property that belongs to my employer." Silas glanced at Ayanna, who had pressed herself against the wall near the window. Her bundle was clutched tight to her chest, the gemstones hidden within. He understood now why her mother had called them cursed. They represented everything ugly about human nature. "Only property I see around here is mine," Silas replied. "See, that's where you're wrong." Garrett's voice had taken on a harder edge. "The girl's got something that doesn't belong to her, something her mother stole before she got what was coming to her." The casual mention of Ayanna's mother's death made Silas's finger tighten on the trigger. He could see through the window that Garrett's men had spread out, positioning themselves to cover multiple angles. They'd done this before. "Here's how this goes," Garrett continued. "You send out the girl, and we'll consider your involvement a case of misguided charity. You try to play hero, and we'll burn this place down with both of you inside." Silas looked at Ayanna again. She was watching him with those intense, dark eyes, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. In that moment, he remembered why he'd helped her mother all those years ago. Not because it was smart or safe, but because it was right. "Counteroffer," Silas called out, moving to position himself where he could see all 3 men. "You ride out of here now, and I won't put bullets in all 3 of you." The silence that followed was pregnant with violence. Then Garrett's laughter rang out again, uglier this time. You always were too righteous for your own good, Ward. Boys heard you used to be quite the gunfighter back in the day. Of course, that was before you got religion and decided to play nursemaid to strays. Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. Garrett knew more about him than he should. This wasn't a random encounter. They'd been planning this. Tell you what, Garrett said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow managed to be more threatening than his shouts. I'm going to count to 10. Then my boys are going to start shooting, and we're going to keep shooting until you change your mind about being neighborly. Ayanna moved closer to Silas, her small frame radiating tension. He could feel her preparing to run, to sacrifice herself rather than let him get hurt defending her. 1, Garrett called out. Silas checked the angle to the back window, calculating distances and cover. 3 against 1 weren't good odds, but he'd faced worse. 2. He looked down at Ayanna and saw something that made his decision for him. She wasn't just trusting him to protect her. She was ready to protect him, even if it meant giving herself up to monsters. 3. Silas took a deep breath and made his choice. But as his finger found the trigger, the sound of more horses approaching echoed across the landscape. Garrett's counting stopped, and Silas felt his stomach drop. How many more men were coming, and whose side would they be on? The approaching horses belonged to 4 men wearing badges that caught the morning light. Silas felt his chest tighten as he recognized the lead rider. Sheriff Marcus Webb, a man whose reputation for bending laws to suit his wallet was well known throughout the territory. Behind him rode 3 deputies, their faces hard with the kind of authority that came from knowing they could do whatever they wanted. Garrett stepped back from the porch, but his posture remained confident. He raised a hand in greeting as the lawman approached, like he was welcoming old friends to a social gathering. Sheriff Webb, Garrett called out cheerfully. Right on time. Silas felt Ayanna's hand tighten on his sleeve. The child's instincts were sharp. She understood what he was only beginning to grasp. This wasn't a rescue. It was a trap that had been months in the making. Webb dismounted with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving Silas's cabin. The sheriff was a tall man with thin lips and cold eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked at. He walked with the measured stride of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Ward, Webb said, his voice carrying across the distance. You're harboring a fugitive. That makes you an accessory to theft and murder. The words hit Silas like physical blows. Murder. They were pinning Rosa's death on Ayanna, making her both victim and criminal in one twisted narrative. Child's done nothing wrong, Silas called back, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Webb pulled out a folded paper and held it up. Got a warrant here that says different. Says the girl killed a prospector named Thomas Reed and stole his claim. Worth a lot of money, that claim. Silas felt pieces clicking together in his mind. The gemstones weren't from Ayanna's mother's discovery. They were planted evidence, proof of a crime that existed only in the imagination of men who dealt in human lives like cattle. That's interesting, Silas said carefully. Considering Thomas Reed died of fever 2 months ago, I was there when they buried him. The silence that followed was telling. Webb's confident expression flickered, just for a moment, but long enough for Silas to see the truth. They hadn't expected him to know about Reed's real death. Garrett stepped forward, his hand moving toward his weapon. Doesn't matter what you think you know, Ward. Girl's coming with us, one way or another. Silas shifted his position, making sure he could see both groups of men, 7 against 1, with Ayanna caught in the middle. The mathematics of violence were clear, but something else was bothering him. Webb and his deputies should have surrounded the cabin by now, cut off all escape routes. Instead, they were keeping their distance, staying in a loose formation that suggested uncertainty. You boys seem awful nervous for men with the law on their side, Silas observed. Webb's face darkened. Shut your mouth, Ward. You're in enough trouble already. But Silas had caught something in the sheriff's tone. Desperation masked as authority. These men needed Ayanna alive and unharmed, which meant they needed something from her that couldn't be taken by force. The gemstones were just part of a larger scheme. Ayanna moved closer to the window, and Silas saw her studying the men's positions with the calculating gaze of someone far older than her years. When she looked up at him, her expression was grim. They killed the others, she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. The other children who knew where the stones came from. I'm the last one. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about theft or murder. It was about genocide disguised as law enforcement. These men were systematically eliminating witnesses to cover up something much larger than a few gemstones. Webb raised his voice again. "Last chance, Ward. Send out the girl and we'll consider this a misunderstanding. Force our hand and you'll be buried next to her." Silas looked down at Ayanna one more time. In her eyes he saw not just trust, but a terrible knowledge of what these men were capable of. She'd watched them destroy her world, piece by piece, and now she was trusting him to be the one person who wouldn't let them finish the job. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders like a mantle he'd never asked for but couldn't refuse. Outside, he could hear the men shifting position, preparing for whatever came next. But as Silas raised his rifle and made his choice, a new sound reached his ears. More horses, approaching fast from the east. And this time, the riders were moving with the urgency of people who had no time to lose. The approaching riders were native warriors, 6 of them, moving with the fluid precision of men who had been fighting for their lives since childhood. Silas recognized the lead rider immediately, and the sight made his blood run cold. Joseph Crow Feather, Rose's brother, a man whose reputation for violence was matched only by his sense of justice. Webb and his deputies turned their horses nervously, suddenly finding themselves caught between Silas's cabin and an approaching force they hadn't planned for. Garrett's confident demeanor cracked, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Well," Silas muttered to himself, "this just got complicated." Joseph raised his hand, signaling his warriors to spread out in a wide arc around the entire group. They moved with silent efficiency, cutting off every escape route Webb's men might have considered. The sheriff's face had gone pale beneath his hat brim. "Garrett," Joseph called out, his voice carrying the weight of old hatred. "You killed my sister. Now you come for her daughter." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Silas felt Ayanna's sharp intake of breath beside him. She hadn't known her uncle was still alive, hadn't known anyone from her mother's family had survived the systematic hunting that had claimed so many lives. Garrett spun his horse to face the warriors, his composure finally cracking completely. "This is between me and Ward, Crowfeather. No need for you to get involved." Joseph's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "You made it my business when you put bounties on native children, when you paid men to hunt them like animals." Silas absorbed this information with growing horror. The gemstones were just the beginning. These men had been conducting a campaign of terror, using the law as cover for something approaching genocide. Webb tried to reassert control, his voice shaking slightly. "I've got legal authority here, Crowfeather. These men are under my protection." "Your authority died with my sister," Joseph replied coldly. His warriors had completed their circle, their rifles trained on Webb's group with steady hands. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 7 corrupt lawmen and bounty hunters surrounded by 6 warriors who had nothing left to lose. Silas found himself in the middle of a powder keg that could explode at any moment. But something was bothering him about the positioning. Joseph's warriors were good, but they were outnumbered and surrounded by men with nothing to lose. Unless Joseph had something else planned. "Ayanna," Silas said quietly, not taking his eyes off the developing standoff. "Your uncle always this theatrical?" The ghost of a smile crossed the child's face. "Mama said he never could resist making a point." That's when Silas heard it. The soft whistle of an arrow cutting through air. One of Webb's deputies cried out and fell from his horse, an arrow buried deep in his shoulder. Then another whistle, and Garrett's horse reared as an arrow sprouted from the saddle horn, missing his leg by inches. More warriors. Joseph had positioned shooters in the rocks beyond the cabin, creating a crossfire that turned Webb's numerical advantage into a death trap. "Last chance," Joseph called out, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Drop your weapons and ride away. Leave the child and the man alone." Webb's remaining deputies were looking around frantically, trying to spot the hidden archers. The wounded man was bleeding heavily, his face white with shock and pain. Garrett made his choice with the desperation of a cornered animal. He drew his pistol and fired at Joseph, the shot echoing across the landscape like thunder. Joseph's horse stumbled, but the warrior remained upright, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Then everyone was shooting. Silas pushed Ayanna toward the back of the cabin as bullets shattered the window above their heads. He could hear men shouting, horses screaming, the sharp crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of pistols. "Stay down," he told Ayanna, then moved to the front window with his rifle. The scene outside was chaos. Webb's men were trying to find cover while Joseph's warriors maintained their disciplined fire from multiple positions. Garrett had taken shelter behind a water trough, but Silas could see blood on his shirt. One of the deputies made a run for the trees only to stumble and fall as an arrow caught him in the leg. The wounded man from earlier had stopped moving entirely. Silas took aim at Garrett, but before he could fire, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Webb had circled around behind the chaos and was approaching the back of the cabin on foot, his pistol drawn. The sheriff wasn't trying to escape. He was coming for Ayanna. Silas turned from the window just as Webb kicked in the back door, his face twisted with desperate greed. The sheriff's eyes found Ayanna immediately, and his pistol swung toward her small form. "Should have minded your own business, Ward," Webb snarled. Time slowed as Silas raised his rifle, knowing he was a fraction of a second too late. Webb's finger was already tightening on the trigger, and Ayanna was frozen in place, her eyes wide with the terrible understanding that her journey was about to end where it had begun, with violence and death at the hands of men who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be solved. The shot that rang out wasn't from Webb's pistol. Ayanna had moved with lightning speed, grabbing the heavy iron skillet from Silas's stove and hurling it with desperate accuracy. The cast iron struck Webb's wrist just as he fired, sending his bullet wide and his weapon spinning across the floor. Webb howled in pain and rage, clutching his shattered wrist against his chest. Silas didn't hesitate. He brought the butt of his rifle down hard on the sheriff's temple, dropping him like a stone. Webb crumpled to the floor, unconscious but breathing. "You all right?" Silas asked Ayanna, who was pressed against the wall, her chest heaving with adrenaline. She nodded quickly, but her eyes were fixed on Webb's motionless form. "Is he dead?" "No, but he'll have a powerful headache when he wakes up." Silas moved to the window to check on the battle outside. The shooting had stopped, and an eerie quiet had settled over the landscape. Joseph's warriors had gained the upper hand. Garrett lay motionless behind the water trough, his shirt dark with blood. 2 of Webb's deputies were down, and the third had his hands raised in surrender, his face white with terror. Joseph himself sat his horse with the calm dignity of a man who had seen justice served. When he spotted Silas in the window, he raised his hand in acknowledgement. Silas stepped outside, keeping his rifle ready but lowered. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and fear. "It's finished," Joseph called out, dismounting and walking toward the cabin. Up close, Silas could see the family resemblance between the warrior and Rosa. The same intelligent eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. "Not quite," Silas replied, glancing back toward the cabin where Webb lay unconscious. "Still got questions that need answering." Joseph's expression darkened. "That one has blood on his hands. More than just my sister's." Ayanna appeared in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dim interior of the cabin. When she saw Joseph, her composure finally cracked. She ran to him with the desperate speed of a child who had thought she was truly alone in the world. Joseph caught her in his arms, and for a moment, the hardened warrior disappeared, replaced by an uncle who had feared he'd lost the last of his family. He spoke to her in their native language, words of comfort and protection that needed no translation. But their reunion was interrupted by the sound of more horses approaching. This time, the riders wore the blue uniforms of the territorial cavalry, and they were coming fast. Silas felt his stomach drop. Webb had been thorough in his planning. He'd arranged for military backup, probably with some story about renegade natives threatening innocent settlers. "How many men you got?" Silas asked Joseph quickly. 6 here, 4 more in the rocks. Not enough if those soldiers believe Webb's lies." The cavalry was close now, close enough for Silas to see the captain leading them. Marcus Stone, a man Silas knew by reputation. Stone was honest, but rigid, the kind of officer who followed orders without questioning their source. "Captain Stone," Silas called out as the soldiers approached. "You might want to hear the full story before you make any decisions." Stone raised his hand, signaling his men to halt, but stay ready. His eyes took in the scene quickly, cataloging the bodies, the defensive positions, the way Joseph's warriors held their weapons. "Silas Ward," Stone said, his voice carefully neutral. "Sheriff Webb sent word about a hostage situation. Native raiders threatening civilians. Sheriff Webb is unconscious in my cabin with a broken wrist," Silas replied evenly. "After he tried to murder a child in cold blood." Stone's expression didn't change, but Silas caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The captain was seeing evidence that didn't match the story he'd been told. "That's a serious accusation," Stone said. "It's a serious crime." Joseph interjected, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. This man and his friends have been hunting native children, using the law as cover for murder. Stone looked between the two men, then at Ayanna, who was watching the exchange with the wary intelligence of someone who had learned not to trust uniforms and badges. The captain made his decision with the deliberate care of a man who understood the consequences of being wrong. I think we need to hear this story from the beginning. But even as Stone spoke, Silas could see some of the soldiers shifting nervously in their saddles. These men had ridden hard based on Webb's lies, and now they were being asked to consider that they'd been manipulated into supporting the very criminals they were supposed to stop. The truth was about to come out. But Silas knew that sometimes the truth was the most dangerous thing of all. Captain Stone dismounted and walked toward the cabin, his hand resting on his saber, but not drawing it. The gesture spoke of caution rather than aggression, and Silas felt a flicker of hope that the truth might actually matter to this man. "Show me," Stone said simply. Silas led him inside where Webb lay unconscious, blood seeping from the gash on his temple. But it was what Silas pulled from Webb's coat that made Stone's face go rigid with understanding. Documents, carefully folded and hidden in an inner pocket. "Bounty notices," Silas said, spreading them on the table. $20 for every native child brought in alive, 50 for adults, dead or alive. Stone examined the papers with growing horror. They bore official seals, Webb's signature, and worst of all, authorization from territorial officials whose names Stone clearly recognized. Ayanna stepped forward and unwrapped her bundle, revealing the gemstones that had started this nightmare. "They said these belonged to a dead prospector," she said quietly. "But my mother found them in our sacred river. They wanted me to show them where." Joseph added his voice to the testimony. "Webb's men have killed 17 people from our tribe in the past 6 months. They take the children who know the old places, the hidden valleys where precious things can be found. When the children have shown them everything, they disappear." Stone's face had gone pale. "This is genocide disguised as law enforcement, and backed by men in territorial offices who take a percentage of whatever gets dug up," Silas added. Webb wasn't working alone. The captain walked to the window and stared out at his men, many of whom were young soldiers who had joined the cavalry to protect innocent people. They had no idea they'd been sent to help cover up mass murder. "The territorial governor signed off on these bounties," Stone said, his voice heavy with the weight of betrayal. "Men I trusted, men I've served under for years." But before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the air again. This time, the riders wore civilian clothes but moved with military precision. 6 men, heavily armed, their faces hard with purpose. Silas recognized the lead rider and felt his blood turn to ice. Colonel James Morrison, retired cavalry officer turned territorial administrator, one of the men whose signature appeared on Webb's authorization documents. "Looks like the cleanup crew just arrived," Silas muttered. Morrison and his men spread out in a loose formation, staying well beyond rifle range but close enough to make their presence known. They weren't here to negotiate or investigate. They were here to eliminate witnesses and tie up loose ends. "Captain Stone," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You and your men will stand down immediately. This is now a territorial matter." Stone stepped outside, his jaw set with the kind of anger that came from realizing you'd been used. "Colonel Morrison, funny how you showed up so quickly. I was in the area when I received Sheriff Webb's report," Morrison replied smoothly. "Native uprising, civilians in danger. You know how these situations can escalate." But Silas caught the lie in Morrison's voice, and so did Stone. The colonel had been waiting nearby, probably since before the cavalry had even been called. This whole thing had been orchestrated from the beginning. "There's no uprising here," Stone said carefully. "Just some questions about Sheriff Webb's methods." Morrison's expression hardened. "Sheriff Webb is a duly appointed law officer conducting legitimate operations. Anyone interfering with those operations will be considered an enemy of territorial authority." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Morrison was prepared to kill everyone present, including Stone and his soldiers, to keep the conspiracy secret. Stone's hand moved to his saber, and Silas could see the captain making the same calculation he'd made earlier. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting odds that no sane man would take. But as tensions reached the breaking point, Ayanna stepped forward with something in her hand that changed everything. Another letter, this one bearing a seal that made Morrison's face go white with fear. The letter in Ayanna's hand bore the official seal of the Federal Marshal's office, and Morrison's face went from confident to desperate in the span of a heartbeat. Ayanna held it out toward Captain Stone, her young voice carrying the weight of finality. "My mother wasn't just hiding from these men," she said clearly. "She was gathering evidence for the federal marshals. This letter proves she was working with them before they killed her." Stone took the document and read quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Morrison with the cold fury of a soldier who had been betrayed by his own command. "Federal investigation into illegal mining operations and systematic murder of native populations," Stone read aloud. "Authorized by Marshal William Hayes, with Rosa Crow Feather serving as primary witness and informant." Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon, but he found himself staring down the barrels of Stone's soldiers' rifles. The captain had made his choice, and his men had followed without hesitation. "You're all making a terrible mistake," Morrison said, but his voice had lost its authority. "The territorial government will not stand for this insubordination." "The territorial government can take it up with the federal marshals," Stone replied, "who, according to this letter, should be arriving within the week to arrest everyone involved in this conspiracy." Silas felt a weight lift from his shoulders as the pieces finally fell into place. Rosa hadn't just been running when she'd found his cabin years ago. She'd been on a mission, gathering evidence of the systematic destruction of her people. When she'd given birth to Ayanna and realized the danger they were both in, she'd made the hardest choice a mother could make. She'd stayed behind to continue the investigation while sending her daughter to safety. "The river where my mother found the stones," Ayanna said, looking directly at Morrison. "It runs through sacred burial grounds. You've been desecrating graves to get to the gemstone deposits underneath." Morrison's composure cracked completely. "You don't understand the value of what's down there. Enough wealth to build cities, to bring civilization to this wasteland. Enough wealth to justify genocide," Joseph said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of loss. Stone stepped forward, his authority now backed by federal law rather than territorial politics. "Colonel Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States government." Morrison made one last desperate play, drawing his pistol and aiming it at Ayanna. "The girl dies unless you let us ride out of here." But Silas had been waiting for exactly this moment. His rifle spoke with the authority of absolute conviction, and Morrison fell without firing a shot. The colonel's men, seeing their leader dead and surrounded by angry soldiers, threw down their weapons without resistance. Webb regained consciousness just in time to find himself in shackles, his conspiracy exposed, and his co-conspirators either dead or captured. The surviving deputies would live to face federal justice, their badges stripped and their reputations destroyed. As the sun began to set, Silas stood on his porch, watching Joseph prepare to take Ayanna home. The child had found her family, and more importantly, she had helped expose the men who had tried to destroy it. "Will you come with us?" Ayanna asked Silas. "Uncle Joseph says there's always room for a man who keeps his promises." Silas smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in years. "Might be I'll do that. Been alone long enough." Captain Stone approached, carrying the federal documents that would ensure justice was served. "Marshal Hayes will want to speak with all of you when he arrives. This evidence will shut down the entire operation." Joseph mounted his horse and helped Ayanna up behind him. She looked back at Silas one more time, and in her eyes he saw not the frightened child who had appeared at his door, but a young woman who had helped bring down the men who murdered her mother. "Thank you," she said simply. Silas nodded, understanding that some thanks carried the weight of entire worlds. As Joseph and Ayanna rode toward the horizon, Silas packed his few belongings and prepared to follow. He'd kept his promise to a dying woman, protected her daughter, and helped expose a conspiracy that had claimed too many innocent lives. For the first time in 7 years, Silas Ward was no longer running from his past. He was riding toward a future where justice had finally been served. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.